Okay, so on conjunctions and slivers, that's our next subject. And so what kind of evidence do we have for these? New moons and Sabbaths. Now, this is this one isn't directly related to new moons and slivers, but to the phrase new moons and Sabbaths, or the new moon in the Sabbath. Because sometimes we get the idea that new moons are appointed feasts, and they're things that we can do. We can have a special thing on that day, and it's okay, it's not a sin to do that. But mainly it was just a time when the priest blew the silver trumpets over the burnt offerings, and they had special prayers that were done at the temple. And lots of times Israelites would go to the temple and they would pray at those times on the full moons with the priest to kind of just get a special blessing there. But it's not a commanded feast. Only the seventh moon is a commanded one. And sometimes this phrase, new moons and Sabbaths, is used in support of that position. But I'm going to go in here and I'm going to show what they're really referring to when you see that phrase. Okay, so 2 Kings 4:8-41, it says, so he said, this man said, why are you going to the man of Elohim today? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. And this story in there is about this woman who couldn't have a child, and so she was praying, and then finally her prayer was answered. She met Elijah, and he said that she would have a baby. And then sometime after that, she had a son. And then her son grew up, and while he was out harvesting in the field, or out in the field with the harvesters, he got some kind of headache, pain in his head, and he went to his father, and then to his mother, and he died in her lap. So it was kind of a sad story, but it was a time of the harvest, and that was one of the key things in that passage, to kind of give an idea of what season it was when this passage, new moon and Sabbath, is used. Because right here it says, why are you going to the man of Elohim, referring to Elijah, for it is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. So it sounds on the surface that it's talking about the 7-day Sabbath, or on the 30th day of a moon cycle, that somehow the man of Yah would come and talk to people and minister or something. And that's generally how it's interpreted. But in this case we see it's at the time of a harvest, if you go in and read it. I just had to summarize it. And if you read to the end of the chapter, you'll find it's also the time of gourds. And gourds, of course, grow at this time of year. And so the conclusion for this particular one would be that it's the time of the festival of the new moon, which would be Feast of Blowing, trumpets. Now, can anyone think of a Sabbath that follows Yom Teruah? That isn't the 7th-day Sabbath? Yom Kippur. That's right. So Yom Teruah is the new moon, and Yom Kippur is the Sabbath. There's actually 3 Sabbaths in Scripture, and the one Sabbath is the 7th-day Sabbath. The second Sabbath is Yom Kippur, which falls on the 7th moon. And then the third Sabbath is the year of rest for the land, which falls in the 7th year. So all the Sabbaths fall in the pattern of 7. The 7th day, 7th moon, and 7th year rest of the land. The first Sabbath teaches us rest from our labor. And so that's what we do. We rest from our labor, and we gather together, and we worship before Yah. And then the second Sabbath, Yom Kippur, is rest from our enemies, because that's the day of vengeance, the day of Yahweh, when he corporately atones for and justifies all Israel, and then he pours his wrath out on his enemies who are not part of Israel, who have rejected his plan of salvation and refused to come into the covenant. And then the year of rest for the land is a picture of when the earth itself will rest. And so the 3 Sabbaths. And these things are pointing to Yeshua's return, because when Yeshua returns, we're going to rest from our labors, we're going to rest from our enemies, and the earth is going to rest. And it's all going to be for 1,000 years, when things will be restored. And after everything is restored, then there'll be new heavens and new earth. And that's where we're coming to Shemini Atzeret. Points to that. And also, while I mentioned that, I'd encourage everyone to be here on Shemini Atzeret, because oftentimes people treat that as a teardown day. But it's a high day, and it's actually one of the most important high days of the whole year. And I'll go over that. I'm actually going to prepare a little teaching on that before we go into the Galatians study on that evening. Just exactly what the word Atzerah means and why it's so important. Yeah, so please don't treat it as a teardown day. And you'll really be blessed, especially with the ceremony that David does. It's such an awesome ceremony. And but ultimately, it's a culmination of it. Just think of all the things that are represented from Passover through Sukkot, and then look at Shemini Atzeret as a culmination of all those other feasts are representing and pointing us towards. That is a consummation of everything. And it's like one of the most beautiful of days. Is ultimately pointing towards the new heavens and the new earth and our eternal destiny with Him. Well, you notice also that all the Shabbatons fall on the seventh moon. We have a tendency to call, first and seventh day of unleavened bread and Shabbat and days like that. We have a tendency to call them Shabbatons or even Sabbaths, but they're not. The Shabbatons only fall on the seventh moon because they also point to the millennial kingdom. Because the root is 7. Yeah. For a Sabbath, the root is 7, and Shabbaton, the root is 7. So everything has to follow the pattern of 7 and point to something that He's going to do on the 7th. Now, another key verse to this position is Amos 8, 1 through 6, and it says, "Thus says Yahweh Adonai." Or, I always say "Thus saith Yahweh" when I read, because that's usually what it says, but this one tricked me, and I did it earlier today. Okay, and this says, "Thus Yahweh Adonai showed me." It's usually always "Thus saith." But, okay, "Thus Yahweh Adonai showed me, and look, there was a basket of summer fruit." And then next verse it says, "And he said, Amos, what do you see?" So I said, "Well, a basket of summer fruit." Then Yahweh said to me, "The end has come upon my people Israel, and I will not pass by them anymore. And the songs of the temple shall become wailing in that day, says Yahweh Adonai, and many dead bodies shall be everywhere, and they shall throw them out in silence. Hear this, you who trample on the needy, and reduce to nothing the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be passed, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, so that we may trade our wheat, so we can make the ephah small and the shekel large, and falsify the scales by deception, so that we may buy the poor for silver, and the needy with a pair of sandals, or even sell the bad wheat." So, a couple key things here. Summer fruit. Now, if you went to Bereshit 8:22, you'd find in there that the scriptures say, "After the flood, therefore seed time and harvest, and winter and summer will not cease to be." But that's basically what's going to be the new order of things on the earth for weather patterns is that you're going to have to plant and harvest. Things aren't going to grow themselves anymore. You have to continuously plant and harvest. Something we didn't have to do before. And it's going to be hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold. Summer, winter. Whereas before it was just summer all year round, before the flood. And you'll notice also, if you read the whole scriptures, you'll find that the terms spring and fall are never mentioned. It's always winter or summer. There's no such concept as fall and spring in the scripture. So when we talk about the spring feast and the fall feast, is what we're really talking about is the summer feast. They're all summer feast. All the harvests take place during the summer. It's just the beginning of the summer we have a tendency to call spring, and the end of summer we have a tendency to call fall, because of the vernal equinox and all that stuff that the Babylonians came up with. Okay, so summer fruit is a key. And then the other key is the term new moon and Sabbath. They're saying, when will the new moon be passed? And the Sabbath, when will that be passed so we can start merchandising and making our money? We're not here to celebrate, we're here to make money. We're merchants. So that's their mentality. And they even want to sell the bad wheat. Well, when's the wheat harvest during the year? At least in Israel, what it is over here. What's Shavuot? Shavuot is the wheat harvest. So by this time, the wheat's already going bad, and they want to get rid of it before it's too bad to sell. See? So that tells you it's Sukkot season again. And so what Newman and Sabbath is being spoken about?
Feast of Trumpets.
Yeah, Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur. Yep. Day of Atonements. So Isaiah says, "For as the new atmosphere and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, says Yahweh, so shall your descendant and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, that all flesh shall come to worship before me, says Yahweh." Now, that sounds pretty complicated. Can you imagine all flesh coming before Him every seventh-day Sabbath and every new moon? Does that really mean that? Well, let's see. There's another clue. Zechariah says, especially in verse 14, 16, "It shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all nations which come against Jerusalem shall come up from year to year to worship the King, Yahweh of the armies, and to keep the Chag, the feast of Sukkot." And 17 through 19 of that chapter says that those who do not come up for Sukkot will be punished with drought. So here it says that they will come up every year for Sukkot, and that if they don't come up for this annual feast, they will be punished. Why would it that if they don't come up for the annual feast, they'll be punished, but not if they don't come every 7th day and every 30th day? So he's saying, all flesh that does not come to me every year to celebrate Sukkot, and come up every year to celebrate Yom Teruah, and every year to celebrate the Sabbath of Yom Kippur, they won't get any rain. So you just tie those together. It's the new moon and the Sabbath that falls during the season of Sukkot. And that solves the dilemma there. When you put those two together, that passage in Isaiah and that passage in Zechariah. So it's only the annual celebration of Sukkot that all nations are required to come to Jerusalem. And that every new moon of Yom Teruah and the Sabbath of Yom Kippur, all flesh is also to appear in Jerusalem. And again, it's the annual season of Sukkot. Now the 4th day of creation. Now we'll kind of go into a little bit about the conjunction aspect of things. Think about Bereshit. Here the sun and the moon were created. Any thoughts on how they might have been aligned? Do you think they might have been aligned maybe at 12 o'clock with a hour hand, minute hand, and second hand all kind of lined up, perhaps? Maybe something like that? Or do you think they might have been aligned more like this, with all the hands all over the place? Kind of like that?
Which one?
Which one do you think would be more logical? What would he start his time clock with?
Left.
One on the left, do you think? I'm kind of persuaded that myself. Any naysayers out there? No? You?
I just have a question. I mean, if he calls the beginning of the year at a certain spot, shouldn't we look roughly to that point to see the way the planets are aligned?
The last part of your
The
question?
beginning of the year.
Uh-huh.
I'm offering the question out there. Should we not look at the beginning of the year and see which way the planets are aligned? If you're
Oh, no, I'm talking about...
seriously actually considering that.
Oh, no, I'm actually going back to creation. When on the 4th day he created the sun, the moon, and the stars?
Yeah.
How do you think he would have started that clock? We'll get into the other part later, about the beginning of the year of Eve or Rosh Hashanah.
No, that's what I mean. What I'm trying to say is, wouldn't that be the beginning of creation, the beginning of the year?
Oh, yes. In fact, the 6,000-year calendar that he compiled, that I was talking about earlier, I tried doing both positions. I tried doing Rosh Hashanah, I tried doing Pesach, and I found I could not get the calendar to fall in place by going from the Aviv to Aviv, which is really interesting. But when I did it from Yom Teruah to Yom Teruah, everything fell in place, which is interesting because the ancient teachers of Israel believed that Adam was created on Yom Teruah. So if he was created on Yom Teruah, well, that would make a lot of sense because if he is formed from the dust of the earth and then the breath of life was breathed into him, and then he became a living soul, what happens to us on Yom Teruah? It says at the last breath, or at the last blast, that we will be raised up out of the dust of earth and the breath of life will be breathed into us also. So you have a parallel there with the creation record. And that would also make sense because Adam, when he was formed, he hadn't sinned yet. Well, do we need Passover? We haven't sinned? Isn't Passover all about redeeming us from our sinful nature? So what did Adam need to be created on Aviv for? He hadn't sinned yet. So that had to be introduced later. In fact, when you go into in the scriptures and you read when they came out of Egypt, he had to tell them when their first moon of the year was going to be. It seemed like if they'd been practicing that since the time of Adam, it seemed like he wouldn't need to tell them when the first moon of the year was. So if he had to tell them, this is going to be your first moon, it's like he's saying, okay, well, you used to do it on Rosh Hashanah, but now I have a plan of salvation for you, Israel, and it's going to start on the Aviv now, because you're my harvest. And so we're going to start at the beginning of the harvest, so I'm going to teach you about my plan of salvation. And it's going to begin with the Aviv. But before then, it appears that they went from Yom Teruah to Yom Teruah.
I just thought of something. Yom Teruah was there before sin.
Yeah, exactly. It was there before sin. Because before there was sin, there was no winter, right? Everything, when Adam was created, was all lush and beautiful. And then sin came in, and now what do we have? We have fall and winter that followed after that. And so now he brings us into the summer harvest and shows us how to be redeemed so that that winter season can be restored back to the summer season. So there's no more winter. It'll just be summer again. There's kind of all these interesting pictures that fall into that. But I'm persuaded here that the fourth day probably started the clock, something looking like that. It's interesting. Think about this. If a conjunction, say this would create a conjunction if they're all lined up like that. So at the fourth day, when the moon, the sun, and the stars are created a conjunction, and Adam was created on the sixth day, and that was Yom Teruah, then does that make it the sixth day a sliver or a conjunction? That was a sidewinder, how that wasn't fair. Yeah, because the sliver is always about 2 to 3 days after conjunction. So I was like, okay, well, that adds up. But it doesn't require it to have started like that. It could have. Seems like it would have. In the bookend calendar, why is it always at least 2 days off of Yom Teruah, the first day of the seventh moon? I was going to show you how many days are in between a conjunction and a sliver on average. And it's almost always 1.5 to 3.5 days. It's always in that period of space there. And we have a thing called the bookend calendar that's going around out there, where basically they take the waning crescent, which is this way from your perspective, and then they take the waxing crescent, and then they determine the conjunction in between the two. They average it out, so it's like 3.5 days, and 1.75 days would be the middle. That might work for the other moons, because you could count at the conjunction and say, okay, we saw this sliver now, and so that means that 1.5 days ago, or whatever, that was the first day, and so now we can start counting there forward for the rest of the month. But it doesn't work for Yom Teruah, because if you already seen the sliver, and you're counting the conjunction as the first day, well, you're already 2 or 3 days off from when you're supposed to celebrate, because Yom Teruah is supposed to be celebrated on the first day of the moon, not on the third day, not on the second day. And it's a one-day celebration. And see, that's another thing too, is they'll say, well, Yom Teruah, they celebrated for 2 or 3 days, and they waited for the waning moon crescent, and then they began celebrating until they saw the waxing crescent, and then they knew to end the celebration, which will make it, anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5 day celebration. But that's not what the scripture says. It says that it's a one-day celebration, and it became a 2-day celebration eventually over time because of the difficulty in sighting the sliver, because you don't know which day. And that's another thing, the day or the hour. When Yeshua said no one knows the day or the hour, he was making direct reference to Yom Teruah and the moon that's sighted during Yom Teruah. So, and that brings up another interesting point, because the conjunction, we know the day and the hour. NASA can tell you it to the nanosecond when the conjunction will occur, but not even NASA can tell you when the sliver is going to come out.
That's right.
NASA can only tell you what the potential visibility that night will be for the sliver, but they can't tell you the atmospheric conditions. They can't tell you, if it's going to be cloud covered or anything like that. So we have to consider things like that when Yeshua is making statements like this. Then should we go by the conjunction? Is it okay to make an exception to do that when we're not able to spot the sliver? That's really what it boils down to. Because in Yeshua's day, the Sanhedrin actually kept it by the sliver. And I got some things I'll show you on here concerning that. Alfred Edersheim, he lived back in the 1800s, and he grew up Jewish, and then he converted to Christianity. And he became a leading historian concerning Jewish history and temple times in particular. He was an expert at what they did regarding the temple and the festivities and things like that. And he's familiar with the historical aspect of the Talmud and so on. And that's one thing too, we often don't realize, that the Talmud doesn't just teach the theological positions of Judaism, but it also teaches the history of Judaism and how they did things. So it's kind of like the religious version of Josephus. Josephus recorded from the secular side of history, and then the Talmud records the religious aspect. So with that in mind, he says in his writings that they actually went by the sliver, and then later on they had to change that because they were dispersed out of the land. We were scattered abroad, and eventually the Sanhedrin came to a close. they were disassembled, and they had no more authority and no more way to determine or even to relay to the people abroad when the sliver had been sighted. So they had to come up with an alternative calendar, or so they thought. They really didn't need to, but they felt that there was a need for Israel to remain unified. And to do this, they had to figure out how to make a calendar that everybody could go by and be on the same page while they're out in the diaspora. And so they came up with a Hillel 2 calendar because it can be mathematically calculated when it comes to conjunction. You can't mathematically calculate a sliver because you don't know which day it's going to be visible on. But the conjunction, you can determine that, and then you just extrapolate outward based on mathematical calculations. You can determine when it's going to fall. Except they didn't realize that the Earth was going to start going crazy, so the mathematical calculations aren't precise anymore. But that's basically what happened. And so the day is going to come very, very soon in our lifetime when that temple is going to be rebuilt and the Sanhedrin is going to be reconvened. And when they do that, they're going to go back to the sliver. They're going to do it just the way they used to do. There's no question in their mind what it was and what it's going to be again. And so it shouldn't be a question in our mind, but the thing is, oftentimes when we come up with things like this, we don't really look to the historians that are expert in these things. Like, if I want to learn about how cars run, I'm going to go to a mechanic and I'm going to ask the mechanic, well, why does the car do this? How does this work? And how does this affect that? And how do you repair it? And so on. If I want to know American history, I'm going to go to someone who's an expert in American history. And if I want to know about Jewish history, I'm going to go to somebody who's expert at Jewish history. And oftentimes we don't do that. Oftentimes we'll just go on the internet and we'll just find articles that seem to agree with our position, and we'll throw those out there as our support. And that's not good theology. We want to go to the experts in their field. And even though we kind of have an aversion to authority, being the rebels that we are in the Messianic community, because we've been so betrayed by authority and leaders. But it's not necessarily because they don't know history, it's just that they've refused to present it to us honestly, because they have investment in keeping the congregations and not losing their tithing base and all that. But people like Alfred Eldersheim, he had no investment. He was a Christian. It didn't matter to him how they kept it. He just wanted to share, well, this is how they did it in the first century. This is interesting history, and he loved it, and it didn't matter to him one way or the other because he didn't have anything to prove in the way of how we do it today. He just wanted to show how they did it back then. And he was an expert at what he did. Anyway, some of these things might have already, we did that. Oh, Babylon. That's another thing, too. The Babylonian system. Now, this is an easy one to research on the internet, and you can find some pretty authoritative sources on the internet. And Wikipedia is okay. It has some pretty good references that you can go. Wikipedia will give a good outline. You can't always trust what people say on Wikipedia, but the nice thing about Wikipedia, though, is they have to give a reference to back up what they say. So if you have any doubts, you can always go to the reference, and then you can read the authoritative references that they quote, and then that will usually let you know if they interpreted things correctly or not. And you can go there and find out all about Babylon, and so what you'll find out is that the Babylonians did things by the conjunction. And it's just one of those things, well, what do we do it with the Babylon? Aren't we coming out of Babylon? Is it one of our biggest things is leaving the church because there's so many Babylonian things in the church that we just couldn't stand anymore? The calendar, the Sunday worship and all that, and Ishtar and Mithras and all that are all based on these kinds of calendars. Vernal equinox and winter solstice and all that stuff. So that's something you can real easy to verify. And I knew I was going to be limited on time tonight, so that's kind of just giving you some ideas of how you can research some of these things yourself. But I knew if I quoted everything, it would take me 3-4 hours to do it all. Length of conjunction of new moons. I mentioned that earlier, 1.5 to 3.5 days. In fact, if we would have had a clear night last night, you would have seen the full moon out there still for the 4th day in a row. The first day would have been 97%, then 2 days 100%, and then last night would have been 97% visibility, which to the naked eye you can't tell the difference. Once it gets down to about 96, 95%, you can start seeing that one edge is slightly flatter than the rest, but at 97% you can't tell the difference. Okay, so there's Alfred Eldersheim that I was talking about. These are some of the pages on his book. This is his book, The Temple, Its Ministry and Services. You might consider getting that book someday. It's fascinating writing if you're interested in the temple things. He tells you everything they did and all the services and what the sacrifices meant and everything. And these are the pages where you can find out about the first century, what they did. The Sanhedrin, they had a thing called the lunar station that was on top of the Mount of Olives. And they would go up there when they They would look for the new moon up there, and they would also set their fires up there once it was sighted. And they'd have people go throughout the land and try and get a report. And the ones that came back with an accurate report, they would have a feast, a banquet for them. So they would be the first ones who would get to celebrate the sighting of the sliver. Here's what they did, is once they sighted it, and the report was made and approved by the Sanhedrin, then they would go up to the top of this mountain, and they would do signal fires. And the signal fires would then be seen by someone on another hill, who would then in turn light another signal fire, and it would go all the way back to Babylon, all these signal fires on the tops of these hills, so that people in Babylon, the Jews who were still out there, would be able to know that the new moon had been sighted in the land. And so the result, of course, is that they end up celebrating during the day, and we get instant everything, so we're already celebrating before we even see this sliver. We're out there looking for it, and as soon as we sight it, we're blowing our horns and dancing, and we're going into the night. But it took them a little bit longer to do it, so they didn't generally start their celebration at night. It was usually the next day when they would start celebrating it. But sometimes they didn't sight it that day, and so it would default to the next day, become a 2-day celebration. And that's where we get the 2-day celebration from. And he goes into that on these pages if you want to write it out and get the book. And it's pretty interesting. Oh, and he even says that they observed it by sight, not by astronomical calculation. That's page 230 of the book. Okay, so we have this thing. The Shoftim, we talk about that a lot in Yeshua, how there needs to be a Shoftim, an eldership of judges to discern matters for the Hebrew roots community. And we don't have that yet, and I don't know if we ever will, because a lot of us don't really want to be under any kind of authority like that.
That's the problem.
Yeah, we don't want to invite judges to judge matters for us, but we really need them, so that we can get some unity in the community. Not for stoning people if they commit adultery, but for determining situations like this. If should we do slavery or conjunction? Should we? How should we do this? How should we do that? And it's more of a thing to kind of clarify and kind of get everybody on the same page. So maybe someday that will happen. It will happen eventually. I'm just not sure if it will happen before the second coming.
Yeah.
But I touched a little bit on what they changed. They changed from the sliver to the Hillel too, because they needed a way to mathematically calculate in advance some kind of day that we could all celebrate in unity on. And so they chose the conjunction, because that can be mathematically calculated in advance. But this is why it's not lawful, because the Scripture says, or this is my position. I'll see if you agree or not.
I agree.
Yeah. You agree? Right. Hallelujah, brother. Yeah, so we have this. We have this one scripture. That's very interesting. Scripture says, "You shall not add to His word, and you shall not take from His word." And so, if we're not in the land, let's say let's pretend that we're in the land and we're observing the sliver, and now we're dispersed, and we go out of the land. Now we have no way to know when the sliver is being sighted in the land. So we have an option. We could either continue observing the sliver where we're at, because that's the best that we could do under the circumstances, or we can come up with a calendar which says do it on a completely different day than the sliver. Now, which one would be taking or adding? Would it be doing the best you can under the circumstances that you're in, or would it be just go to something completely different? Something different would be adding or taking on it. So they really didn't have any authority to do that, did they? That's my position. And did you know that it took centuries? They have records 1,000 years later. Jewry around the world still had not accepted this calendar. It took a long time for all the Jews to get on the same page with it, because they did it by the sliver. It's like, well, why are you giving this calendar? Why should we do that? And of course, the argument for unity won out, because Jews, they're not like Ephraimites. Ephraimites would love to be divided, be independent. You just look at America; it's full of Ephraimites. But you look at Judah. What are they? I mean, and they're always together. They fight together. They stand together. They have different views on religion, but they still love each other. They still live with each other. They still visit with each other. And they're always one big giant community, and they're very cultural, and one big giant family. And they're okay having differences. They don't divide over being different. They might have to go to a different synagogue, might choose to be New Asia or something like that, but they still recognize each other as family. Why do we need to wait for a Sanhedrin to go back to what Yahweh already told us to do? He never told us to depart from that. And we have the ability to know when it's sited in Jerusalem. I mean, granted, if we did not have a way to know when it was sited in Jerusalem, I'd say, well, let's just cite it here. Let's do it when we cite it here. But we have ability to. We have internet, we have instant messaging and email and telephones and all that stuff. Do we need it? Do we need a Sanhedrin to tell us that? I mean, Yeshua already made his own Sanhedrin. Remember, he appointed his 70? So he didn't go by the Sanhedrin of the time. He had his own Sanhedrin, and they did things Yahweh's way. So when the other Sanhedrin that were politically appointed, they went off and did this other thing. I'm pretty sure that Yeshua's Sanhedrin and their descendants weren't doing that. But if we don't go back to that for some reason, then when they rebuild the temple, they will. But I think it would be kind of neat to make Judah a little bit jealous by maybe getting back on the calendar before they do. I think that'd be kind of neat. I always wondered how we're going to make them jealous. The scriptures say that Ephraim is somehow going to make them jealous. I don't see it right quite yet, but I think we're getting there. We're working on it. So, the first new moon of the agricultural calendar, we can see it in Exodus 12:2, and it says, this moon shall be the beginning of moons. It should be the first moon of the year for you. So this is kind of like I said earlier, it's like, well, why did they have to tell them that if they were already keeping, no, this is the beginning of the year. So this is where I think a change took place. Because now he has his people, now he has Israel, so now he needs to show them his plan through the blood of the Lamb. And so he creates a new beginning of the year. But the kings continue to be coronated on Yom Teruah, like they did all, well, they didn't have any kings yet, but when they started to have kings, they continued to use Yom Teruah as the beginning of the year for the coronation of kings. But this other calendar started for the redemptive calendar. And this is one of the evidences. This is now the flax and the barley were struck by the hail, for the barley was in the head and the flax was in the bud. On this moon you are going out in the moon of Aviv. Now this is one of the answers to the question when people say, well, no, we need to do the Passover, the first new moon for Passover after the vernal equinox. So when you hear that argument, you can say, well, hold it. But here it says that their first new moon was at the time that the barley was in the head and the flax was in the bud. He said that's the Aviv moon. And it just so happens if you go by the Aviv moon, then Passover will always be just right after the vernal equinox. But the new moon isn't always. Sometimes it's before and sometimes it's just a little bit after. But the barley knows when it's supposed to be right because it's a harvest festival, right? We have to offer up the first fruits.
Right.
So if we wait until the moon after the vernal equinox, and, well, the barley's already gone. The first fruits are already gone. They're already rotted on the stalk and you'll be in the main harvest. Well, we're not commanded to offer up the main harvest. We're commanded to offer up the first fruits of the harvest. So if you go by this, which always happens to fall around the time of the vernal equinox, then you'll always have your first fruits to offer up during Passover week, unleavened bread. So this is another one that you'll hear. They'll say that we need to be in unity with Yehuda, with Judah. They're our brothers, right? So if they're using the Hillel calendar, we should be in unity with them. Well, that sounds good. Sounds real good. But if we say that about Judah, why don't we say that about the church? Well, we need to be on the same calendar as the church and start going to services on Sunday. We want to be in unity with our brothers and need to celebrate Christmas and Ishtar with them, right? Right. Same calendar, right? So if we want to, we can be really celebrating people by, if we do Christmas and Easter, and then we do the Jewish thing, and then we do the Aviv, and then we do the conjunction, and we can be celebrating every year, every day of the year. It's like, wow. So it doesn't really make sense to be in unity for the sake of unity. We want to be in unity when it makes sense. And this is the key, I think, because what's our prayer? Our daily prayer is, Our Father in heaven, honorable and respectable is your name. Your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So his will done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, is heaven keeping the Hillel 2 calendar? Yeah, so he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I suspect that the way he did it in Egypt is the same way he did it in Hillel's day, and the same way he's doing it today, and the same way he's going to do it 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. So how does heaven do it? Now it says Jerusalem is where his throne is going to be, right? And it's a picture of the one in heaven and all that. And then it says, like we read tonight, that all nations will come to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Sukkot. The Sanhedrin, when they reckoned the time, the Sanhedrin was in Jerusalem, and they reckoned the time from there, and they proclaimed it on the Mount of Olives up there at the lunar station. So I think maybe it's Jerusalem time. And the things are sighted in Jerusalem. You think maybe that's where Hashemayim goes by that location in the earth? Probably not New York, probably not Japan, probably not Moscow. Okay, Jerusalem. So the clock is in Jerusalem. I'm thinking, okay, if there's a clock in Jerusalem, and that clock begins with the Aviv, in the first sliver sighted after the Aviv, then that should be the time that we go by, if we're able to. And if we do that, if we can agree to all do it as the kingdom of heaven does, I think that's really the only way we can get on the same page, is if we can agree to do it when heaven does it. Because if we try and do it by man's calendars, well, everyone's going to favor one man's calendar over another man's calendar. There will never be unity in that. So we have to agree on what Yahweh's calendar is, on the abundance of the evidence. And history makes it very clear it was a sliver. So, Star of Bethlehem. Now this is one that will work. Now this is kind of cool. You'll like this. So this is intermission here. So we get the commercial, and we get to watch the Star of Bethlehem for our commercial. So they could follow it from Babylon. At first they saw it show up, and then it just kept reappearing like this flashing beacon in the sky, and covering almost like 9 months period of time or something, until finally at the end it just kind of hovered over Bethlehem there, and they were able to locate where Yeshua was at. And I thought that was just so neat that they came across that, and it just happened to fit right in with the timeline that I compiled, the 6,000 year timeline, and that's where I had placed Yeshua's birth. It was right in 3 BCE, and when I saw that, it's like, wow, they got it right. they agreed with the Bible. Wow. I love it when people get the Bible right, when they agree with what God says. So many historians and stuff, or not so much historians, but archaeologists and others like that, so often they don't use the scriptures for their basis. And so they interpret the scriptures through their findings, and really need to interpret the findings through the scriptures. But that was nice that they actually used the scriptures as their guide, and then they were able to find the Star of Bethlehem because they actually used the scripture for the basis. Now we have this calendar here. Now that we were talking about the birth of Yeshua, 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. Now, they're what Judaism would refer to as 2 Sabbaths. And we would only call it 1 Sabbath, but in Judaism they called the first day of unleavened bread a Sabbath because it was a day of rest. And so since it had similar qualities, they would call it the Sabbath. But it's really just a high day. And when Yeshua was placed on the tomb, it says in John 19:31, Yochanan 19:31, it says that high day was a Sabbath. Then in Mark 16:1, it says that after that high day, or after that Sabbath, the women went and bought spices. And then they prepared the spices. And then in Luke chapter 23, verse 56, it says, then they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So you had one Sabbath by tradition, and then you had one by commandment. So one was a high day, one was a seventh-day Sabbath. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So in other words, they bought and prepared the spices after the high day, and then after they rested on the seventh day, then they went to the tomb. So here's what it looks like. This is in my timeline number 4. And I go over the whole week, and I just took a little piece out of it to kind of narrow it down. You have Passover night, which is T-Day night, Pagan Tuesday. So I just say T-Days, and then W-Day, T-H Day. Okay? And I try not to say days of the week if I can avoid it. So T-Day night would have been Passover. And W-Day is Passover Day. So that's the day that Yeshua was crucified. Then W-Day night was the beginning of the high day. That's when Yeshua was placed in the tomb. And then on TH Day, during the daytime, that would have completed the first day in the tomb. Then TH night, this is the second day of unleavened bread, and the women were rested, of course. And then that day on F Day, then the women purchased the spices. It's the second day of unleavened bread. And then after that, they rest on F day night, or Ev Shabbat. And then as the Sabbath ends, then the women take their spices and they go to the tomb. And then, of course, then you have first fruits after that. Now, this might be a little bit easier to follow this calendar, because I kind of wanted to show it from two different ways. This is calendar number 10, timeline number 10 in our booklet. And here you can see the Passover. So here's the evening. You see Tuesday night, there's the evening when he had his meal. Crucified this day. And then first day in the tomb from here. And then second day in the tomb, third day in the tomb. And then he's resurrected shortly after Sabbath. And then as the first fruits from the grave. And then the following, on the daytime part of that day, which we call Sunday, the first day of the week, that's when he ascended to the Father as a wave offering for the bickering. So knowing what day Yeshua was crucified narrows the timing of the first day of the moon down to either a conjunction or sliver. So you have two possibilities for the site of the sliver, and you have one possibility for a conjunction, because the sliver is one of 2 days. And so you have to pick which one it is. So what are the options? If we take the day that Yeshua was crucified and we count backwards, because he would have been crucified on the 14th of the moon. So if you take the day he was crucified and count backwards 14 days, where would it land? Well, if you go here, so here's the day of the crucifixion. So go back 14 days. So from this evening to that evening, that's 1 day. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It lands on a sliver. So Yeshua kept his Pesach by the sliver. Isn't that amazing? And here's the conjunction. To here would be 1 day difference between the sliver and the conjunction that year. And no one knows the day or the hour of a sliver, not even NASA, until after it has occurred. So now we can look backwards and see when it occurred. Did you know also that one of the reasons why we know that this is the day that he kept his Passover, because of those 2 Sabbaths, the high day, which really isn't a Sabbath, but they called it one, and then you had the day of work in between, and then you had the 7th day Sabbath. So you had TH day, and then you had F day, and then you had Sabbath, which made Passover fall on the W day, fall on Wednesday. So if you go by that day of the week, and then you go through this moon calculation software, and you research the years 25 through 35 of the calendar back then, 25 AD or CE to 35 CE, and you try and find which day the 14th day of the moon landed on a W day, you find 28 CE is the only year where it landed on a W day. In all those other years, from 25 to 35, all the ranges that all the scholars consider, it doesn't land on this day of the week. So you're able to narrow it down to that. And that fits in with the time of Yeshua's ministry, because that was the time of his ministry, it's 27 and 28 CE. And I actually have another study to show why it was just a 1 year ministry, and not a 3 or 3.5 year one. If you looked at when they came out of Egypt, you would find the exact same pattern. They had Passover on the same day of the week, and they left Egypt on the same day of the week. The first day of unleavened bread was on the same day of the week. So it was identical. And it was also on the sliver for the first day of that moon. Remember King David, they had a feast dinner with King Saul, and it was during a new moon. And King David was concerned about going to the feast because he thought that King Saul might kill him. And so he's looking for reasons not to go to the feast. And he talks to Jonathan, and he says, "Indeed, tomorrow is the new moon, and I know I must sit with the king to eat, but let me go that I may hide in the field until the 3rd day at dusk." Then Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow is a new moon, and you'll be missed because your seat will be empty." Then it says, in a few verses later, when you have stayed away 3 days, so again, this 3-day number, so David hid in the field, and when the new moon had come, the king sat down to eat the feast. So it was a feast. That's a key word there. And this verse says, "If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city, for there an annual sacrifice is there for all the family." So it's an annual feast, and there's an annual sacrifice. And it's the new moon. Yom Teruah. See, so there's the answer right there. It's Yom Teruah that's being described. And So, how long is it sometimes? If they can't cite it the first night, if they don't cite it, it becomes a 2-day feast. It defaults to the next day. So that explains why he wouldn't come back to the third day, because the third day he wouldn't have to sit at the king's table and get killed. So that's a simple solution to that one. And then of course that 801.3, which sometimes is used for the conjunction because of the word covering, bekese, but now from the other night, those who are here, that the covering is referring to Yom Kippur, not to the full moon or dark moon. It's not referring to either one of those. So blow with the renewed moon, and shofar on covering day of our feast, our Chag. So this is a paraphrase of it. Blow the shofar at the new moon and get on Yom Kippur during the season of our Chag of Sukkot. So, yeah, so there are any questions or answers or challenges or... Thank you. Praise God. Yeah. Well, I'm glad I could feed you all tonight. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Make Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you, and be gracious unto you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, Kavarim, Shalom, Kavarim, Shalom, Shalom. La Hitrao, La Hitrao, Shalom, Shalom. Farewell, my friends, farewell, my friends. Now is peace, now is peace. Till I see you again, till I see you again. Shalom, 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 shalom. Shavuot. Lila tov.
Good job.
Shavuot tov, Lila tov.
Good job.